Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Nevada State session. And I see some familiar names and boxes and a few familiar faces. And so thanks for attending. So I just had a few quick sort of Nevada DEP updates before I turn it over to Kristen to talk about the Nevada climate strategy, and mainly to deal with our water program. So I just wanted to highlight for folks that we started a rulemaking process for our anti-degradation program. For those of you that may not be familiar, within the Clean Water Act, there are requirements to maintain waters that have higher quality and to have a program in place for doing that. And we've been looking at ways to make the program in Nevada more consistent. And we've also looked at an opportunity to provide a more transparent process for designating specific high quality waters as having ecological, aesthetic, or recreational significance. The only water in Nevada right now is the bi-state Lake Tahoe that is an outstanding natural resource water and also a Nevada ecological and aesthetic water. And so we proposed an initial agency draft in June, and I'm going to send the link out in the chat box. But there's going to be quite a bit more outreach happening over the next several months, and we expect this regulation to come as proposed before the State Environmental Commission, which adopts regulations proposed by NDEP, and that's currently scheduled for April or probably April or May right now, but more to come. And so I'll send that link out into the chat box here, and people can take a look at that. And just a couple of one other update for folks that track our mining programs and mine permitting. We recently had our Bureau Chief of Mine Regulation and Reclamation, Joe Sawyer, retired on October 2nd, and we have promoted Amy Keys. Amy Keys was formerly the branch closure branch supervisor within our mining program, and she's taken over that position as of this past Monday, so just this week. And we still have a number of new ways of tracking what's happening in the mining program, not only proposed permits, but permits that are sort of in the queue and that are coming. And so if you haven't checked out our mining website in a while, you might want to be able to understand what's coming down the pike, as well as what's open for public comment. So just with those brief comments, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kristen Averitt. We're really pleased. She's been on since I think March or April when we formally announced her arrival. And she comes with a, not only a great, published and scientific background, but really a commitment to collaboration and communication and making science understandable to a lot of us who don't have the degree of specialization. So we're really happy to have her aboard. And we're going to explain the climate initiative here. So I'll turn it over to you, Kristen.
Well, thanks, Greg, and thank you, Cliff, and thank you everybody for the invitation. I really appreciate it today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly kind of run through the timeline of what we're doing at the state level and what's been done in the last year or two as it relates to climate change. And then get your phones and open a browser window, because we're going to have a couple interactive sort of components to this, because I want to hear from you guys what your perspectives are. And because we're not all in the same room, we're going to do this virtually. So the state, I'm going to talk, as Greg mentioned, a little bit about the Nevada Climate Initiative, as well as the state climate strategy. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to start this timeline back in March of 2019. In March of 2019, Governor Sisolak committed the state of Nevada to the US Climate Alliance. Some of you might be aware that President Trump, when he basically took over, he basically took the US out of the Paris Climate Accords. And what a lot of the states have done in the absence of that commitment at the federal level is that the states individually have committed to the Paris Accords. And right now there are 25 states across the US representing over 50% of the population that are part of the Climate Alliance. And the minimum criteria for joining the Alliance is to reduce emissions by 28% below what they were in 2005 by the year 2025. So that was really the first step. The second step, the legislature in April of 2019 adopted SB 358, and that was of course signed into law by Governor Sisolak, and that set renewable portfolio standards at 30% by 2050. You might also be aware that this is also a question on the ballot right now to integrate this into the Constitution, so it would be more difficult to change in the future. This was followed on by SB 254. And SB 254 establishes emission reduction targets that are actually among the most aggressive in the entire United States. They're actually more aggressive than California's. And these targets, of course, there's that 28% commitment, which is part of joining the Climate Alliance, but then 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by the year 2050. The other part of SB 254 required not just a greenhouse gas inventory every 4 or 5 years, which is what was happening prior, but that an inventory be delivered every year. And it also requires of that inventory a projection of what future emissions would be under the current set of policies. So this graph on the right, this represents kind of a basic outline of what came out of that inventory. And this was put together, of course, by Greg's awesome team. And what you'll see is on the left-hand side of that dotted line, that represents the emissions inventory for different sectors and what we've basically seen how things have evolved since 1990 up until the year 2016. And there are two important things to notice here. The first is that the transportation sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the state. It exceeds emissions from the energy sector, and that's largely because of retirements of coal-fired power plants. And this is something that we're actually seeing across the entire United States because we have had record retirements of coal-fired power plants. So that's decreasing the energy sector emissions, but then we're seeing this increase in transportation as well. The other component is that the fastest growing sector is actually industrial emissions. And this is because of hydrofluorocarbons, which are a very potent greenhouse gas that are associated with refrigeration and air conditioning. So transportation and industry and kind of green buildings, these are two very important areas for looking at emission reductions. And based on that inventory, the current policies that are in place, we would fall short of the 2025 target by about 4%. So we need 4% more in reductions. And the 45% goal, we're about 19% short. So there are additional things that we need to do as a state in order to meet the targets that were established by SB 254. Following on, the governor issued his Executive Order 2019-22 in November of last year. And really the centerpiece of that executive order is for the state to develop a climate strategy. And in that climate strategy, we must contemplate the different policies that can help us to meet those emission reduction targets that were established by SB 254. This, in the executive order, it directs the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, as well as the Governor's Office of Energy, to essentially corral all the agencies across the state to develop this strategy. Now, just fairly recently, a couple months ago, the governor launched his broader State of Nevada Climate Initiative. And this initiative is intended to be the broader place where all of climate action across the state sits. So the climate strategy is meant to be just one component of this broader initiative. The initiative is intended to include, for example, multiple roadmaps about how we would tackle climate change. There's the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. There's how do we prepare rural communities, for example, for enhanced wildfire risks. There are a lot of different thrusts and a lot of different fronts that we need to tackle climate change on. And so all of those will essentially coalesce under this broader climate initiative. And the ultimate mission of the initiative is to ensure a healthy, vibrant, climate resilient future for Nevada. So now I want to talk very specifically about the strategy, which again, the strategy is here, the initiative is really the big thing, okay? So there have been multiple components of the strategy. And right here, I've listed the different agencies that are collaborating in the strategy, and also just kind of a punch list of these different components. The first is we have some of the experts from across the Nevada system of higher education, the experts in climate, are pulling together a brief assessment of how is climate actually affecting our state? What are we seeing? What do we need to be worried about? Then the centerpiece of this iteration of the strategy is really a policy analysis. And this is the part that looks into detail at very specific policies that could be implemented to meet the emission reduction targets. Now, what we did is we looked at that in-depth greenhouse gas inventory that I mentioned before. In the very back, starting at roughly page 75, there's a catalog essentially of all these different options of how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it's very clear if you look in that catalog that there are some very specific options that could be adopted. And so we have multiple teams that are looking at roughly between 15 and 18 very specific policies and evaluating the policies on 4 different metrics. The first metric is what kind of reduction could be achieved and in what time frame if we implemented the policy. The second is climate justice. Have we consulted and talked enough with our low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous populations to ensure that we know what impacts could be, are there any risks that we need to consider, and have we explored net benefits to those communities? The third component is budget. How much is it going to cost? But also what could be the long-term return on investment if we implemented that policy. And then finally, what we're calling legal feasibility. It's just how difficult would it actually be to get this done? And the idea is we're not going to say, this is what we're not going to do. We are not going to say, we recommend this policy. We are going to say what we do and what we don't know under those 4 different metrics. It's called, it's in nerdy academic speak, it's considered a risk-based framework. The idea being, if you implement it and you don't know much about one component, well, you're kind of taking a risk there in implementing it because you don't really know all the outcomes and all the consequences, whether they're positive or they're negative. Then we will also be exploring how the state itself and different agencies and departments could actually get to zero and lead by example and adopt their own internal policies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have a section on how the heck are we going to finance all this? What are the different options? What are other states doing? We will have a section that is pointing towards climate resilience and adaptation, which is really about how we deal with the impacts of climate change that are being visited on our communities. Climate governance, what does it actually look like? What are different options that we could adopt as a state to stitch climate into the system? And then finally, what is the role of climate action and clean and green jobs in economic recovery? What are the opportunities there? So that's kind of the lay of the land with the strategy. I will say, again, I can't emphasize this enough. This is just step 1 of what is going to be multiple steps. This is not the end all and be all. I am not a fan of documents that just sit on a shelf and we don't do anything about it. This is intended to be a living document that's really focusing on setting up frameworks, processes, and long-term initiatives around climate. It's not just about the short term. We're going to do one sort of policy, plant a flag. Can't plant a flag if you don't have a really good foundation, otherwise it's going to fall down. So our stakeholder engagement, we had a climate survey that was out, it was done by some of the experts at UNLV, where we were soliciting input just kind of about what do people care about with respect to climate change. And we will be reporting out these results some of the results in our climate strategy. We had over 1,500 responses to the survey, and unfortunately, it did close last Friday. I hope that people were able to fill this out and that this was disseminated. We tried to get it out. I know in COVID land, it's a little bit more difficult sometimes to spread the word on these things. The intention here very much is to get a feel for what our communities care about. So that way we can look forward to resilience and adaptation planning, not just that mitigation. So right now, I'd be really interested if folks are willing to do this. I'd like to ask, since the survey is closed, I'd like to ask all of you guys a couple questions and get some answers from you guys. I will say I'm not going to know who answers these. I'm not going to publish these. This is more, I think it's a good centerpiece for discussion. So you have 2 options. You can either log in using your browser. You can go to this URL. It's pollev.com/Nevada Climate. There's no E. I don't know, it just did that for some reason, 297. So you can go to that, or you can use your phone and text Nevada Climate, no E, 297 to 22333, and it will log you in to this. And thank you for bearing with me on my little experiment here, because I just wanted to do something that was a little different, because I gotta say, I get really tired of just death by PowerPoint, particularly on Zoom. So, all right. Wave at me if have you guys logged in? Anybody done this? All right, I see a couple waves, so I'm feeling good about this. All right, so how concerned are you about climate change? Does it keep you up at night? Are you concerned, sort of worried? Where do you fit? How do you feel about this? Oops, let me go back. I promise this will work. My computer's a little slow. I think it's grumpy with me. Uh-oh. Okay, so this poll should be activated and you should be able to see it. Can people see it? All right, I see people are responding, and as you respond, it'll change the percentages up here. Huh. All right, so I see it looks like it's kind of done. So I have to say, this is really, I'm sorry that it keeps you up at night, but I am one of those people that also keeps up at night. And I'm not going to say encouraged that people are concerned, but obviously this is an issue, particularly if everybody's here in this session. And so I appreciate that. All right, so the next one. No, that's not right. Okay, which of the following climate issues are you concerned about? And you can actually enter up 3 times. You can refill this one in 3 times. Water. Huh.
Dr. Avery, are you seeing the comments on chat?
I am not, but I'm going to try.
Yeah, it's saying that it's saying answer A, B, C, or D, but there's
yes.
more. But there's more choices on this one.
Oh, okay. So if you see on the screen, you can answer E, F, G, H, I. So you should. It's got ... up here, so you can any of these letters. So F is extreme, or E is extreme heat. F is tourism and recreation. G, environment. Storms. Yeah, I'm having trouble getting the chat up. I apologize for that. All right. So I have to say that, oh, good golly gee, let's go back to this. I apologize. Again, I'm like, I haven't done this in a while. It's a great teaching tool, but sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge on Zoom. So I appreciate your patience with this. Come on, there we go. All right, this is super interesting. So I really appreciate, again, everybody filling this out. And I'm interested, would anybody, I mean, I'm happy to open up the floor. Would anybody like to share anything that they think is missing here, or any other issues that aren't listed here about which people are concerned, or to elaborate on anything, any of their answers? I'd really love to hear from people what you think.
Hey, Cliff, this is Mervin.
Hey, Mervin.
You hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Mervin.
I think one thing you don't have on here are non-native invasive species.
That's a good one.
Also, the accessibility to traditional plants and medicines, foods.
Yeah, that Doctor, that was something I noticed too. There's food, agriculture, and ranching, but under our cultures, the medicine plants really don't fall into those categories, but they are of vital importance to Native American tribes. I don't know how that is put in there though.
Oh, that's okay. This is why I want to have this conversation, because if we're missing it, I want to write it down, and this will be captured. This is why I think it prompts a really good discussion. So I've got this written down. Anything else? What else am I missing?
I think you're also missing the public health component, Like I know in our climate change adaptation plan, we have a whole section dedicated to the increase in mosquitoes and illnesses caused by mosquitoes. So I think you're missing some of the public health stuff.
That's absolutely right. I will say the full survey, it just says public health, but vector-borne disease, absolutely. That's something, the mosquitoes are bananas, right?
Yeah.
And then on the chat, I'm going to jump ahead. There are previous questions, but I'm going to jump to these because they're answer to your question. So Jefferson from the Yerington Paiute tribe as political control of these issues is a concern. Yeah, and we're talking about funding often with that, so I don't know where language on bills need to take that into account. And then there's loss of wilderness, open spaces, wildlands. Victoria Kernox asked that. I mispronounced your name, sorry.
Wildlands, all right. So what I would encourage is please drop it in the chat, or I don't have this up on the screen. You can email any questions, any comments, any additionals to climate@dcnr.nv.gov. That's where we're taking in a lot of comments about climate. And I just want to point out, not everything's going to go in this strategy. A lot of this will also be used to frame the broader initiative. So there'll be pointers in the strategy to say, hey, we're working on these different things. Because our intention is that this is not just, hi, I'm dropping in, giving a presentation, and I'll see you in a year. It's how do we start a longer term conversation around climate change and what's the best way to do it? So this is really intended to be the beginning of not just the strategy and an initiative, but a dialogue. So I really appreciate all the input here.
And I have a question, but there's also some, Mervyn also says population growth, wastewater, and solid waste. Oh yeah.
Waste, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then my comment is when I read this, one of my concerns is as we're dealing with the voting thing and other issues is I want to make sure there's language in there that this is a statewide initiative and that if we have these things in place, do they act as guidance? Can counties go on their own? And it would be good to address that so counties just can't go, solo and do their own thing.
That's a really good point, Cliff. And one thing that I will say, we're trying to talk, I think I've probably had one-on-one and kind of small group conversations with about 60 different people over the last, and I say people, kind of organizations, entities over the last month or so. And it's very much to find out what are different people doing around climate, what kind of actions are being taken, and to kind of try to build those relationships across jurisdictions of this is my county, this is my city, this is my land, this is yours. Because I think that harmonization of policy is incredibly important to your point. So I appreciate that. All right, so this is great. I love this and thank you for all the comments. So I'm gonna move on to the next question. And this is one that's open-ended. And when I say open-ended, you can type into your computer, you can type it into the chat however you want. But this is something I'd really like to get a better feel for, is because I know like so many of the tribes that I was familiar with when I used to live in Colorado and that we worked with were very much, they were doing more on climate change than the state or municipal actors. And so I'd love to know what's going on that's related to climate change in different communities across Nevada. And I know the Washoe have some efforts, et cetera. So if you're willing, you can just type this in and it shows up on the screen. Otherwise, you can send it in the chat, or you can even send me the document if there's any documents or anything through that climate email. So I'll leave this up for a minute. Otherwise, we'll move on because I want to continue this conversation around some other topics.
And for the Nevada tribes, even California, we have a lot of tribes on the border of California and Arizona, and even Utah and Idaho and Oregon. Just forward your questions to me or Greg, and we can also forward them to Dr. Averett.
Thanks, I appreciate this. All right, I'm just gonna move on from this because nobody has anything to share with me, but I just love to know what's going on and what we can learn and other communities can learn from what's happening on tribal lands. So the other thing that we did, and I'm going back to kind of stakeholder engagement beyond the survey, is we held a series of listening sessions. And I know Mervin was a frequent flyer at our listening sessions. I saw him on multiple of them. And so thank you for participating. And during these listening sessions, it wasn't me talking like I'm doing right now. It was truly just introductory comments around some very specific climate related topics with some framing questions, and trying to elicit feedback from communities about what the thoughts were. We had a lot of participation kind of from representatives from NGOs, from industry, et cetera. And, you know, not as many kind of, I hate to say normal, like on the ground folks, but, you know, we're going to figure out how we can do that. We've tried the best that we can. We had a lot of participation in some of these. We had upwards of 250 people participating, and we took all the public comment that, when people wanted to speak. We are done with the listening sessions, but if you're interested in what other people had to say, you can go to our website. It's climateaction.nv.gov/strategy. And we have videos of each of the listening sessions posted there. So if people are interested, please go there. And when you look through the framing questions, if you have any responses or something that you want to share, please, once again, you can send us comments to climate@dcnr.nv.gov. All right. So I pulled out from those listening sessions what I hoped we could talk about a little bit and get some opinions on. And of course, otherwise, I'm happy to answer whatever questions have come in the chat. I wanted this to be more free form and more of a discussion than just me blah, blah, blahing at people, because I'm tired of doing that. But these were 5 of the topics that we had at the listening sessions. And I pulled out what I think are a couple of the questions that I would love to get more feedback on from this group. So renewable energy, air quality, economic recovery, climate justice, and natural and working lands, which was really meant to be part of the discussion under land use and land planning. And if people want to kind of have a read through this, if there's any responses to this or any comments just in general, even if it doesn't specifically answer these questions, I'd love to spend the rest of our time digging into this and answering any questions that you might have for me.
I've got a question, Kristen. This is Mervin.
Yes.
So when the White House and the majority of the GOP leadership in Washington constantly deny climate change existence, you know, how is this affecting, you know, this initiative for the state of Nevada?
Well, what I will say is, you know, we joined the Climate Alliance for a reason. It's going to take global action and significant global action to combat climate change, not just to reduce the greenhouse gases, but to tackle the adaptation and how it's going to impact us. So we are moving ahead regardless of what the federal government might do and what might happen on election day. We are going to continue to try and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of how it could impact us, I mean, there's always funding, but I will say, a lot of the funding has stayed in place for climate, even through the Trump administration, through different parts of the agencies. And, you know, leveraging what funding we can from the federal government to support state programs is going to be very important moving forward. And Greg, it looked like you had something to add.
Yeah, and so one of the steps that NDEP is taking is we're evaluating adoption of the California Clean Car Standards through model year 2025 right now. And since EPA has revoked California's waiver, we are evaluating, you know, how we should craft our regulation so that it is basically set up to, you know, recognize that it actually can't go forward unless that waiver is somehow reinstated, either through court order, settlement, or through withdrawal by, you know, a future administration. So there are going to be, I think, you know, I think you're going to see, you know, a bit of, I'd say, inefficiency overall as the states try to tackle these issues independently rather than, you know, in a unified way. One other thing that we've seen is the state inventory tool that NDEP uses that hasn't been updated quite as frequently. You know, to sort of adapt to, you know, the latest international standards for how we estimate global warming potential of various pollutants. And so you're kind of seeing the states step up, but I think it's it can have an effect that is seen in individual kind of circumstances. But we're doing what we can with what we have, I guess is.
Hey, Greg, this is Mervyn. Thank you. That's, I appreciate, this description of, what the state's doing. I'll only say that, with each state, I mean, that would be great, if we can get a collective group of states, if not all of the states, to come together as independent governments to, address climate change, separate from, what the federal government is trying to do. But I see, one of the problems I see with, with looking at state to state is, the contracts and the consultants, that are connected to each state, and the competing conclusions, by different companies that, represent interests of the state. And I think, this is certainly something we've seen through any realm of negotiation, is seeing that, if you pay your consultant enough money, they'll basically argue your interest, to the point that water flows uphill. I mean, this is how crazy I've seen negotiations get, when it comes to water rights and management of water resources. But it's, it is a matter of the populations accepting the fact that we have to adjust to the changing climate. We have to adjust to, just like what's happening here in Northern Nevada. We haven't had levels of precipitation, in the last 3 months that is comparable to anything. And I mean, we see the forecasts of, 20% chance of rain. And, the last 4 or 5 forecasts that have come in that way, that 20% really should be 0%. I mean, we get some clouds, rolling over, but that's it. And I just see that, I mean, to talk about, to hear Trump talk about, toilets and, the conservation measures that are, and this is what I took from his comment about, toilets is, he's attacking conservation. And conservation is a critical component for any population, to adjust and to, and to utilize the limited resources to the extent that we can. And so I've always seen that as neighbors, we have a resource, a limited resource that we have to share, and we have to share in common. And it's my hope that the level of interest that we have toward a limited resource such as water is going to be one that is going to be equal. In other words, that we have the same level of respect, toward this element of life that, we can carry forward with understanding conservation. And so I'll just stop there and thank you.
Yeah, Doctor, I want to answer some of these questions that are in chat as we look at this screen.
Cliff, could I
yes.
respond real quickly to
sure.
Mervyn? So hear you loud and clear, Mervyn, on, what's really important about this strategy that I think, Kristen said, but I think it bears saying again, is that it really sets up, a framework for analysis of policies that we think is going to sort of I would say like rise above or, you know, not be subject to, you know, very particular interests. It's setting up a framework that says, you know, here's the battery of analyses and here's the rigor with which we should look at things in kind of a uniform and consistent way. And so, you know, rather than coalescing behind, you know, very specific policies and championing those, this is really putting, you know, all the policies on an equal footing and, you know, kind of looking at them from all these different factors. And so I think that, you know, we're trying to build something that'll outlast any individual, you know, interest or party.
Yeah, and just since we're on this, one thing I wanted to convey is so the National Tribal Caucus is who's the body for tribes that communicates to the American Indian Environmental Office and the Office of International Tribal Affairs, and it has been brought up to bring this issue to the ECOS, the Environmental Council of States, and kind of get on track and be so everybody's on level on climate strategy. So it has been discussed, but whether that's a realistic goal, I don't know. But that's just my comment. But I do want to go to some of these questions before we run out of time. We have about 20 minutes. Mervyn did have another question. It says, to restore, maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, what is the integrity standard for the state of Nevada? I guess it's a Greg or.
It's a Greg.
So we have within our water quality or water pollution control statutes, which are NRS 445A, we basically have a, you know, an overarching, you know, anti-degradation standard, and that's supplemented by, you know, similar to the Clean Water Act, beneficial use standards that are set up for individual, you know, streams based on how those are used. And so I unfortunately don't know it right now, but that's, you know, I could cite that and look that up. That's what we're required to do by statute.
Okay. And then Jefferson had a question. Why is the military left off the GHG inventory? There's a lot of military activity in Nevada without military data accounted for. The GHG emissions go will never be accurate. I think it's a Kristen question.
That's actually a Greg question.
So what I can say is that the way, you know, for the military, I think we're talking about, you know, obviously importation and combustion of fuel as a huge component of the footprint there. All the flows, you know, petroleum and jet fuel all go through the same distribution network, most of it coming from the West Coast. So all that fuel importation is assumed to be combusted. You know, I think when you're talking about aviation fuel, that's a little different, you know, especially, you know, when you're talking about commercial transport and, you know, those kinds of things. I don't think there's a great way to capture those emissions on a statewide basis right now. That's something that, you know, truly would take interstate and probably national cooperation. We know there's efforts to work on that. But I do think that, you know, as far as, you know, on the ground fuel that's combusted or used for heating, electricity generation, whether it's, you know, in a military sector or others, you know, other major sectors like mining, those should be accounted for in our inventory, but not separately. Military is not separate, but it would be in, you know, the transportation and probably industrial sectors.
Where does the explosives detonation go? There's been, you know, there's a bombing range between Schurz and Fallon that has been used most of my lifetime. You could feel the ground shake. How do you account for those emissions?
I don't think we have those in our emissions inventory. You know, I could look, and you may be more familiar than me, whether or not, you know, I know the Department of Defense in the past has identified, you know, climate change as a national security issue. I don't know if they have a separate inventory carbon footprint for DoD operations, but I can research that if you're interested in finding out more. But I don't know if there's a way for us in our inventory to account for explosive detonation.
Okay, thank you. Jefferson also had another question, real good question that I want to second too. Sub-issue with water in the past, tribal agriculture was followed due to drought, but Army Corps of Engineers allowed the rich corporate farmers to continue farming during drought. The virtual loss for rural desert communities is too great. So taking that into account, is that taken into account in the strategy?
So this iteration of the strategy per the governor's executive order is very much focused on mitigation. So it's about reducing the greenhouse gases. It's less about how this particular iteration, again, it's less about how we adapt and have those really difficult discussions about, getting industry, getting rural communities, getting the water experts all at the table to have those difficult discussions. What we anticipate, and this is part of that's the survey and what we're trying to get back from folks and comments just like this one, it's the, what are those really sticky issues that we need to tee up from an adaptation perspective to have further discussions. And this is part of setting up a process and a framework by identifying, what are those kind of bigger issues, because the harmonization among the natural resource availability, growing population, climate impacts, that is a much more difficult issue to tackle in some ways than greenhouse gas mitigation. And we're walking before we run at this point. But I really appreciate that point, because that is a good point for discussion.
Yeah, is there a way that tribes would be able to leverage themselves with Army Corps of Engineers to have that same reversal for tribal agriculture?
I actually can't comment on that. I don't know if Dom or Greg can, but I am not terribly familiar with the details there. I mean, I'm happy to look to find out more, but I do not know.
I'm actually not sure either. Just so folks know, Dominique Etchegoyen, our deputy director in the department, has joined us for this call. I don't know, Dominique, if you have other ideas on that question.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
All right, so a little context. Back in the late 2000s, I believe, there's a period of drought where agriculture along the Walker River was fallowed for 2 or 3 years, I believe, maybe another year there. But the Army Corps of Engineers reversed that ruling only for the rich corporate farmers that I'm aware of here in Mason Valley. And it was kind of like hush hush, but because my family's very active in the farming scene, my auntie walked into that meeting and witnessed it.
Okay, so unfortunately, that's something I'm going to have to plead ignorance on. I'm not aware of that. That's an issue I could look into more, but I unfortunately don't have anything to offer regarding that situation and the fallowing of land in that area in the past.
I have a question. Is there, with the coalition of states, is there any talk of leveraging or having a conversation with the federal government about putting the historical climate change data back online, since it all disappeared?
That's a great question. I will say you can actually find those sites. There are organizations that have archived all of those sites, and the NOAA.
I know they forgot NASA has some climate change.
Exactly.
They forgot.
NASA,
We don't say that too loud, but
I was going to point you to that. And then also NOAA has the NCEI. It's the National Centers for Environmental Information. And you can find a lot of information there. And it's very much tied to a lot of the NASA data. So even though there are other agencies whose data is not readily apparent, that's there. And the US National Climate Assessment data and that site, those are all still up.
It was right at the very beginning of working on our climate adaptation plan, and I found myself taking screenshots of things that were disappearing as I was trying to look them up. It was interesting.
Interesting is a good word for it.
So a couple other things. So here's a comment from Pat from California. She actually, do I know Pat? Our California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires groundwater sustainability plans to be drafted and include climate change impacts to groundwater. Is that going to be taken into account?
So one of the things that we are exploring, and we've gotten a lot of comments about through our process, is in that lead by example. Even though we're talking about mitigating greenhouse gases within the agencies, it's should we be adopting something statewide so that any natural resource planning considers climate change? And so that's obviously something that that's been suggested to us. I will say that in a lot of ways, I can't speak to the groundwater or the state engineer in Nevada in terms of how that happens, but I hear that we've heard that's a similar recommendation more broadly and similar input.
And then Alfreda from the Oco Band Council. In the statewide climate change, the tribe's concerns need to be voiced and possibly need a seat at the table with the state. I can kind of start with that. So I have been invited with Dominique and Greg. Let me know about this in the summer sometime. And where ITCN is drafting a resolution that would have me as basically a seat, being lack of a better word, a stakeholder in these meetings, because there's a state group, but that there would they've invited me to it. If someone else wants to do it, I'm happy with that. I do know that Susan Jamerson and her team did a really good job with their climate change strategy, and perhaps it would be good to have her sit at the table, or Mervyn up there in Pimber Lake, or someone from Pimber Lake that are further along the process. And the Walker River Tribe has a climate change specialist. Perhaps that will fall in their purview. They would be better. But at the time, no one else really wanted to do it, so it's like I didn't step forward. Everybody else stepped back. But,
so I have a couple comments on that, if you don't. But
sure.
So one part I mentioned of the strategy is governance, and right now, just so everybody's aware, I started on March 11th, and we shut down on March 14th, and the strategy is due December 1st, and so. It's not, oh, poor me. That's not what I'm saying. I actually think we're doing an awesome job on this, and we're trying really hard to engage with people. But because of the way this has been designed at this point in time, leading up to this first iteration of a strategy, remember, this is going to change. It's going to be a living document. We've had an interagency working group since it's necessitated that it's state employees engaged. Or kind of in the drafting of the strategy is the way that I would put it. But what we're looking for is this exact kind of input. This is what we're trying to get through our stakeholder process is what would governance look like? Like, what is this going to look like? Do we continue with interagency working groups? And then we have, I'm just throwing things out here, working groups of experts. I mean, what does this look like? Do we have the continuation of like kind of my role of a climate czar? Do we have a climate office? Where does it sit? What does this look like? And so just the comment of course we need tribes at the table from the start. That's the intention. And it's to identify what are all of the organizations and entities we need to make sure are there at the forefront to take what we set up as a process in the strategy to move it forward and design the multiple roadmaps that we're going to need to under the broader climate initiative. So I really appreciate that, and I didn't know about the ITCN. I think that's the resolution. I think that's wonderful, but we haven't designed the structure yet. We're looking for input on what the structure should look like. So I would love to hear more about that from people if you have ideas.
Well, and I'll add something there, Kristen. And Dominique might want to as well. As folks may know, there was a coordination and collaboration with tribes legislation in 2019, AB 264, that would affect basically all state agencies. And the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources provided input to the Nevada Indian Commission related to a policy that would apply to state agencies broadly. And I think that would probably have a effect on how this whatever comes out of the climate strategy in terms of governance should appropriately interact with tribal nations based on how that policy gets written and implemented. We understand that's still underway in terms of being drafted.
I know that Dominique has talked about this with the ITCN board. We didn't get any feedback from our tribal leaders, and that's where discussing with Dominique and Greg, maybe our programmatic people will probably be better to gather this information from for comments, meaning the environmental directors and their staffs. But what I suspect, Kristen, is people are kind of filtering back to work right now, I noticed. Really, a lot of people weren't in their office working, and that I think that had a lot to do with not getting feedback on this, because I do know this is an important topic to, I think, every environmental program. But I suspect you're going to get a lot of stuff last second in November. That's what I'm thinking.
I hope people, I hope we get any feedback sooner rather than later, because November we have to kind of dial things in. So we're really wrapping up our stakeholder input just in the next week or two. So I really hope people will, any contributions. But again, remember, it's not the end all and be all. It's not the strategy is the thing and we're going to disappear for 10 years. It's intended to have follow on and prompt more discussions. And we're hoping to learn. We've learned so much through this. It's going to be the discussions after the strategy about, okay, there's a gigantic elephant that is climate change. We've got to grab the tail or an ear or something and get started. And so we got to figure which part we're going to start with and design something moving forward. So that's just kind of another comment that this is ongoing, but strategy is just the first thing out of the gate.
Okay, and I have one quick question, then we have about 5 minutes left for any other questions or even any general questions for Greg or Dominique. Is this going to be a living document, the strategy?
Yes.
Okay.
So when I say it will be web-based primarily, it's going to be web-based, and it will be, when it's living, the way that we're trying to consider right now how we want to get input on a strategy when it comes out. We have multiple ideas out there, but one thing that we're considering, for example, I mentioned that framework, that 4-metric framework for each of these policies. Well, we're going to learn more information as we go along. The science is going to get better. The policy will evolve. We'll have more discussions with different communities. And so we're going to be able to update, hey, what we do know and what we don't know. Hopefully we get more into the what we do know category to better inform good public policy moving forward. So that's just the mitigation framework. But then again, setting up the processes and these discussions, that is really what makes it a living document for us. So one thing we've considered, and I'd be interested in what people think about this, is we could open up the entire shebang for public comment and just update every year, every 2 years or something. Or we can open up sections and we could say, hey, we're going to redo another iteration of the climate resilience and adaptation section. We'd like to open this up for comment for a month, and then we'll redo it. We're thinking about different models. So if people have input on that, that's part of the governance. But a living document is absolutely the goal. Absolutely. I have enough reports on my shelf that don't just sit there.
Right, thanks. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I apologize. I was hoping we'd have more time for open questions to the state and Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Does anybody have any other questions? You can put in chat or voice.
I have another question. We sit in California, Arizona, and Nevada. Are you in any conversations with California and Arizona? And are we going to get caught in a situation where, like, when we're trying to do mass fatality planning, all 3 states have different laws, and trying to rectify those laws for our organization is just makes those pieces just absolutely horrific to work on. Are you guys kind of in conversation with the other states and kind of so that all of this stuff is going to flow together? Or is it going to be California is going to have this policy, Arizona is going to have this policy, Nevada is going to have this policy, and we're stuck in the middle trying to figure out how to fix that?
That's a fantastic question. So to the same extent that we're having discussions kind of with counties, municipalities, and people internal to the state about how, hey, where are we butting up against each other, and kind of setting the stage for those discussions through the US Climate Alliance, we're also having those discussions with different states, because like you say, not everything ends at the border, right? And so, how does that manifest? I'd be interested in learning more about some of those very specific interstate challenges. The Climate Alliance right now is very much focused. They are focused on mitigation. So it's just greenhouse gas emission reduction. But brand new working group within the Climate Alliance determining how we're going to tackle resilience and adaptation as well. And that is what I'm one of my personal passions, because quite frankly, we're committed, even if we stopped emissions today, we're committed to at least another 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. And that's going to have a lot more impact. So we need to be preparing in that time frame as well for what we're going to be doing. And so recognizing that the Climate Alliance is trying to develop that. So I'd love some examples that I could bring back. I'd love to hear some more on that.
Thank you, Doctor. And so we're about done. So for follow-up, you can put questions in chat, but I think we're about to close out. You can email me or Greg or Kristen, and then there's the website. The website again, Doctor, was, oh, you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. It's climateaction.nv.gov. And we will be rolling out the strategy on that website on December 1st. And we will, there's additional pages on the website that we'll be releasing as we get a little bit more time in our schedules to update those. But I just want to say thank you all for your feedback. This was exactly what we were hoping for, was more to have a discussion and get some feedback than to just have death by PowerPoint. So I truly appreciate this, and please this is just the beginning of discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would urge everybody, make comments. We have these wildfires. We're going to have, basically the increase in temperature creates more energy in the air, and we're having these extreme weather conditions. And we're talking about this strategy in a fiduciary responsibility for the state. We can't always rely on FEMA and other people for getting these projects that need to get done to protect this. So we're also talking about safety, health and safety. So it's important that we address this. That's me getting on my soapbox. Oh, and then Lisa Gover had a question. We'll have to get to that. She was hoping to hear how the comparison is with California's limits for GHGs, but another day. Yeah, we can follow up with that, Lisa. Okay, Greg, do you want to say goodbye or?
I think, yeah, that was great, everyone. And thanks for joining and contributing to the discussion and listening. And I look forward to hearing more from everybody, and hope you have a great rest of the virtual conference. I know that Nevada Governor Sisolak will be speaking at the closing ceremony, and we're happy to participate. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.